There is a word that the British establishment invented in the aftermath of what happened in Manchester on the 16th of August, 1819. The word was Peterloo. It was not invented by the government. It was not invented by the cavalry officers who ordered the charge. It was invented by the people who were there. The survivors. The witnesses. The journalists who watched from the edges of the crowd as the horses came in with sabres drawn and the screaming started. They took the name of Britain's greatest recent military triumph, the Battle of Waterloo, where Wellington had defeated Napoleon 4 years earlier and made Britain the undisputed dominant power in Europe, and they attached it to what had just happened in St. Peter's Field. Peterloo. The battle where the enemy was the crowd. Where the cavalry charged not French soldiers but English men and women who had walked miles through the summer heat to stand in a field and ask, peacefully, to be heard. The name was an act of savage irony, and the establishment understood exactly what it meant, which is why they spent the next 2 centuries doing everything in their power to make sure most people never heard of it. To understand what happened at Peterloo, you have to understand what Manchester was in 1819. It was not the city it would become. It had no elected member of parliament despite being one of the largest and most economically significant places in Britain. The Industrial Revolution had transformed it in the space of a single generation from a modest market town into a roaring, smoke-filled engine of textile production. And the transformation had happened so fast and so completely that the political structures governing it had not moved an inch to keep pace. The people who lived and worked in Manchester, the mill workers, the weavers, the factory hands, the tens of thousands of men and women whose labor was making the cotton trade the most profitable industry in the world, had no political representation whatsoever. None. Not a single member of parliament spoke for them. Not a single vote had been cast in their name. They existed, in the eyes of the British political system, as economic units, as inputs, as hands, and the hands were suffering. The years immediately following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 had been brutal for the working poor of industrial Britain. The war had driven demand for textiles. The peace collapsed it. Mills cut production. Wages fell. Unemployment rose. The Corn Laws, passed in 1815 to protect the profits of landowners by keeping the price of imported grain artificially high, meant that bread, the most basic staple of working-class life, was priced beyond the reach of families who were already struggling to eat. In some parts of Lancashire, workers were surviving on near-starvation diets. Children were going to work in the mills not because their families wanted them there but because without their wages the family did not eat. The economic misery was not abstract. It was physical. It was the weight of hunger. The specific exhaustion of a body that is not getting enough food while being asked to perform 12 hours of industrial labor every day. Into this landscape of economic desperation came the radical reform movement. It had been building for years, fed by the ideas of Thomas Paine, energized by the example of the American and French revolutions, and given new urgency by the specific miseries of the post-war industrial economy. The reformers wanted 2 things above all else: the repeal of the Corn Laws that were keeping bread expensive, and parliamentary reform that would give the new industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds actual representation in a parliament that was still dominated by rural landowners representing constituencies so small they were essentially private property. These were not revolutionary demands in any meaningful sense. They were not calling for the overthrow of the monarchy. They were not advocating violence. They were asking, with considerable patience and restraint given the circumstances, to be included in the political system of the country their labor was making wealthy. The language of the reform movement was the language of rights, of fairness, of the basic principle that people who bore the economic burdens of a society ought to have some say in how that society was governed. The establishment heard something different. What they heard, or what they chose to hear, was the echo of Paris in 1789, the storming of the Bastille, the guillotine, the terror, the complete dissolution of social order. The reform movement's entirely reasonable demands for parliamentary representation were filtered through the establishment's profound and barely concealed terror of what had happened in France and reframed as the opening moves of a revolution that needed to be suppressed before it could begin. This is the psychology that made Peterloo possible. Not cruelty for its own sake. Not simple contempt for the poor, though there was plenty of that too. It was fear. The specific fear of people who have a great deal to lose watching a crowd of people who have very little gather in a field and demand change. And when the powerful are afraid, they do not always make careful distinctions between a peaceful political meeting and an existential threat to the social order. The meeting planned for St. Peter's Field on the 16th of August, 1819 was organized by the Manchester Patriotic Union. The main speaker was to be Henry Hunt, one of the most celebrated radical orators in Britain, a man who could hold a crowd of tens of thousands with his voice alone. The organizers were meticulous about the peaceful nature of the event. They drilled the contingents of marchers in orderly procession. They explicitly banned weapons of any kind. Women were encouraged to attend and to bring their children, partly as a genuine expression of the breadth of the movement and partly as a conscious signal that this was a peaceful family gathering and not a revolutionary mob. The marchers came from across Lancashire, from Oldham and Rochdale and Stockport and Middleton. They walked miles in the August heat, dressed in their best clothes, carrying banners with slogans about reform and representation. Some of the banners were made from material the marchers could barely afford. They had saved for them. They had sewn them by hand. They were proud of them. They were proud of themselves, of the discipline and the organization and the sheer number of them. 60,000 people converging on a field in Manchester to make their voices heard through the only means available to people who had no vote and no parliamentary voice. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The magistrates of Manchester had been watching the preparations for the meeting at St. Peter's Field with a fear that had curdled, over the preceding weeks, into something closer to paranoia. They had been corresponding with the Home Office in London, sending letter after letter describing the reform movement in language that bore almost no relationship to what was actually happening on the ground. In their letters, the peaceful drilling of marching contingents became military training. The banners became revolutionary flags. The meeting itself became an insurrection in waiting. They had convinced themselves, or had chosen to convince themselves, that what was coming to St. Peter's Field on the 16th of August was not a political demonstration, but the opening move of an English revolution. The Home Secretary at the time was Lord Sidmouth. He was not a stupid man. He had access to intelligence from across the country, and he knew, at some level, that the reform movement was not a military operation. But he was also a man of his class and his time, shaped by 2 decades of watching what popular movements had done in France, and he had made a political calculation that suppression was preferable to accommodation. Better to crush the reform movement before it grew too large to crush than to make concessions that might encourage further demands. He had given the local magistrates to understand that they had the full backing of the government if they chose to act. That backing was the loaded weapon that the Manchester magistrates carried into the 16th of August. On the morning of the meeting, the magistrates assembled in a house overlooking St. Peter's Field. They had at their disposal a substantial military force. The regular cavalry of the 15th Hussars, the Cheshire Yeomanry, the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry, a part-time militia drawn largely from the ranks of local tradesmen and shopkeepers, men who had personal economic grievances against the reform movement and personal scores they were not entirely reluctant to settle. There were also infantry units and artillery. Cannons. The magistrates had positioned artillery around a peaceful political meeting attended by families with children. The crowd that filled St. Peter's Field that morning was everything the organizers had intended it to be. Orderly. Festive, even. Women in white dresses. Children on shoulders. Banners catching the August breeze. The sheer scale of it was extraordinary. 60,000 people in a space that made them press close together, a sea of faces stretching in every direction. Henry Hunt arrived on the hustings to enormous cheering, the kind of sound that 60,000 people make when they are hopeful, when they believe that their numbers alone constitute an argument that cannot be ignored. The magistrates watched from their window and made their decision. They signed an arrest warrant for Henry Hunt and dispatched a message to the cavalry to move in and clear the field. What happened next unfolded in a matter of minutes, though the people who lived through it would describe it for the rest of their lives as something that seemed to happen both very fast and very slowly at the same time, the way traumatic events always do. The Manchester and Salford Yeomanry moved in first. They were supposed to escort the constables who were to arrest Hunt. But the yeomanry were not professional soldiers. They were local men on horses, some of them drunk, most of them frightened by the size of the crowd pressing around them, and some of them angry in a way that had nothing to do with military discipline and everything to do with class resentment and personal animosity toward the people they were riding into. When the crowd pressed around their horses and the noise and the chaos overwhelmed whatever thin veneer of procedure they had arrived with, they began using their sabres. Not in defense. In attack. The 15th Hussars, the professional cavalry, were ordered in to rescue the yeomanry who had become entangled in the crowd. The Hussars were disciplined soldiers who had fought at Waterloo. They knew how to move a crowd. They rode in with a controlled aggression that was, in its way, more terrifying than the yeomanry's chaos because it was deliberate. Their horses pushed into the mass of 60,000 people who had nowhere to go. The field was enclosed. The exits were narrow. People fell and were trampled. People were cut by sabres as they ran. Women were ridden down. Children were separated from parents in the crush and the screaming. The whole thing was over in less than 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, St. Peter's Field went from the largest and most hopeful political gathering in the history of the British Reform movement to a scene of carnage. 18 people were killed. The exact number has been disputed by historians for 2 centuries, with some accounts suggesting the true figure was higher. Deaths that occurred in the days and weeks following the event from injuries sustained in the field that were never officially connected to Peterloo. More than 600 people were injured. Men with sabre wounds. Women with broken bones from being ridden down. Children caught in the crush. The banners the marchers had saved to make and carried with such pride were torn down and destroyed by the soldiers. Among the dead was a 2-year-old child named Mary Fildes, knocked from his mother's arms by a yeomanry horse as she tried to flee. There was John Lees, a veteran of Waterloo who had survived the French cavalry only to be cut down by British cavalry in a field in Manchester. There was Margaret Downes, a woman who had come to the meeting with her neighbours and did not go home. There were others whose names survived and others whose names did not, the way the names of the poor so often fail to survive the events that kill them. The journalists who witnessed the massacre began writing immediately. James Rowe of the Manchester Observer, one of the key figures in establishing the historical record of Peterloo, was at the field and documented what he saw with a precision and fury that the authorities found deeply inconvenient. John Tiers of the Times of London was also present, and his account, published within days, brought the events of St. Peter's Field to a national audience that had been given no reason to expect what had happened. The government had anticipated a suppressed insurrection. What Tiers described was a massacre of unarmed civilians. The gap between those two things was wide enough to cause a political crisis that the establishment had not prepared for. The response of the government to that crisis tells you everything you need to know about where power actually resided in Britain in 1819. Lord Sidmouth sent a letter to the Manchester magistrates congratulating them on their decisive action. The Prince Regent, acting in place of the incapacitated King George III, sent his formal approval of the measures taken to preserve public order. The men who had ordered cavalry into a crowd of 60,000 unarmed people were not investigated, not censured, not held accountable in any meaningful way. They were thanked. And then the government moved swiftly to make sure that what had happened at Peterloo could not happen again. Not by reforming the conditions that had driven 60,000 people to walk miles in the August heat to stand in a field and demand to be heard, but by passing the 6 Acts, a package of legislation that restricted public meetings, suppressed radical publications, expanded the powers of magistrates to search homes and seize property, and effectively made the kind of organizing that had produced the Peterloo meeting illegal. The response to the massacre of civilians was to give the government more power to prevent civilians from gathering. The reform movement did not die at Peterloo, but it bled. The immediate aftermath was a period of suppression so thorough that many of the organizers were arrested, tried, and imprisoned. Henry Hunt was convicted of seditious conspiracy and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. The Manchester Observer, the newspaper that had documented the massacre most thoroughly, was forced to close under the financial pressure of repeated legal harassment. James Rowe was prosecuted. The voices that had been loudest in demanding accountability were systematically targeted and silenced. And yet the story did not end there. Because Peterloo had done something the magistrates and the Home Secretary and the Prince Regent had not anticipated. It had made the cause of parliamentary reform impossible to ignore. The very violence used to suppress the movement had given it a moral clarity and a political energy that peaceful meetings alone might never have achieved. The blood spilled in St. Peter's Field became an argument that no amount of government congratulation to the magistrates could fully answer. 18 dead. Hundreds wounded. A 2-year-old child knocked from his mother's arms by a cavalry horse. These were not the casualties of a suppressed revolution. They were the casualties of a government that had chosen violence over reform, and the country was going to have to decide what it thought about that. The decision would take another 13 years. But it would come. 13 years after the horses rode into St. Peter's Field and the sabres came down on the crowd, the Great Reform Act was passed by the British Parliament. The year was 1832. It was not a perfect piece of legislation. It did not give the vote to the working men and women who had marched to Peterloo. It extended the franchise to middle-class property owners, a significant but carefully limited expansion of political participation that left the vast majority of the industrial working class exactly where they had been in 1819. Without a vote. without representation, without a voice in the parliament that made the laws they lived under. But it was a crack in the wall. And cracks, given enough time and enough pressure, become openings. The connection between Peterloo and the Reform Act is not a straight line. History rarely moves in straight lines. It moves in the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance, pooling in unexpected places, sometimes disappearing underground for years before surfacing somewhere nobody anticipated. The reform movement that produced Peterloo fed into the Chartist movement of the 1830s and 1840s, which fed into the trade union movement, which fed into the Labour Party, which eventually produced the welfare state, the National Health Service, and the legal protections for workers that people in Britain today take so completely for granted that they have largely forgotten they were ever fought for at all. That forgetting is one of the most consequential things that happens to history. Not the dramatic forgetting of events that are simply lost to time, but the quiet, comfortable forgetting of struggles that succeeded. When a right is won, when a protection is secured, when a reform is finally passed after years or decades of resistance, it tends to settle into the landscape of ordinary life so completely that within a generation or two it becomes difficult to imagine that it was ever absent. The weekend, the 8-hour working day, the minimum wage, the right to join a union, the prohibition on child labor. These things feel natural now, like features of the world rather than victories extracted from people who did not want to give them up. But every single one of them was fought for. And many of them were fought for by people who paid a price for the fighting that the beneficiaries never had to pay. The people who marched to Peterloo paid that price. And they paid it for demands that were, by the standards of 1819, considered dangerously radical, but that by the standards of any reasonably functioning democracy look like the absolute minimum that a society owes the people who make it work. The right to vote, the right to assemble, the right to petition the government without being ridden down by cavalry. These are not revolutionary demands. They are the baseline. And in 1819 Britain, the baseline was considered so threatening to the established order that the government sent soldiers to prevent people from asking for it. There is a figure from the Peterloo story who does not get nearly enough attention in the standard historical account. Her name was Mary Fildes. She was the president of the Manchester Female Reform Society, one of the most significant women's political organizations in early 19th century Britain. She was on the hustings at St. Peter's Field on the day of the massacre, standing near Henry Hunt when the cavalry came in, dressed in white as many of the women reformers were that day, a deliberate visual statement of peaceful intent. She survived. She continued organizing afterward despite the repression that followed. She is in the famous painting of the Peterloo Massacre by Richard Carlyle, a small figure on the hustings surrounded by chaos, and she is there not as a bystander but as a leader. Mary Fildes and the Manchester Female Reform Society represent something important that the Peterloo story usually glosses over. The reform movement of the early 19th century was not exclusively or even primarily a male enterprise. Women were deeply embedded in it, organizing, speaking, marching, and suffering the consequences alongside men. The women who attended Peterloo were not there as the wives and daughters of male reformers. Many of them were there as political actors in their own right, with their own analysis of what the industrial system was doing to their communities and their own demands for change. The cavalry did not make distinctions. The sabres fell on women as readily as on men. And yet the history of the reform movement, like almost every history of political struggle in this period, has tended to center the men and margin the women. Mary Fildes should be as well known as Henry Hunt. The Manchester Female Reform Society should be as prominent in the story as the Manchester Patriotic Union. The women who bled at Peterloo should be named with the same specificity as the men. That they are not is not an accident. It is a choice that historians have made, generation after generation, in the way they have decided whose experience constitutes the main story and whose constitutes the supporting detail. The physical site of the Peterloo Massacre is not easy to find today. St. Peter's Field no longer exists as an open space. It has been built over, absorbed into the fabric of modern Manchester, covered by the Free Trade Hall, which was itself later converted into a hotel. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, there was no permanent memorial to the people who died there. The establishment that had ordered the cavalry charge was not enthusiastic about commemorating the event, and the absence of a memorial was itself a kind of ongoing political statement. We will not remember this. We will build over it. We will let the city grow over the graves, and eventually people will stop asking where the bodies are. It was not until 2007 that a proper memorial plaque was installed near the site. Not a monument. Not a dedicated memorial space. A plaque. On a wall. in a city that was built in significant part on the labor of the people whose political awakening culminated in that field on a summer morning in 1819. The inadequacy of that recognition is something that the people of Manchester have been arguing about ever since, and in 2019, on the 200th anniversary of the massacre, a permanent monument was finally unveiled. 200 years. That is how long it took for the British establishment to formally acknowledge, in stone, that what happened at Peterloo was wrong. 200 years is a long time to wait for an apology that never quite arrived. Because the monument does not come with an apology. The British government has never formally apologized for Peterloo. The descendants of the magistrates who signed the arrest warrant have never been asked to account for what their ancestors did. The institution of the British state, which congratulated the men responsible and then passed laws to make sure it could never be held accountable for what they had done, has never been required to reckon with that history in any meaningful way. This is how power protects itself across time. Not through active suppression forever, because that becomes untenable eventually, but through the management of memory. Through the slow replacement of accountability with commemoration. Through the conversion of a political crime into a historical curiosity. Through the building of plaques and monuments that allow a society to say we remember without ever having to say we were wrong. We are sorry, here is what we owe. The people who walked to St. Peter's Field on the 16th of August, 1819 were not asking for anything that the society they lived in could not have afforded to give them. They were asking to be counted, to be heard, to be included in the political life of a country that was being built on their labor and their sacrifice and their bodies. They were asking, in the most peaceful and organized and dignified way they knew how, for the minimum that any society owes the people who sustain it. The answer they received was cavalry. Sabres. 18 dead. Hundreds wounded. A 2-year-old child knocked from his mother's arms. And a letter of congratulation from the Home Secretary to the men who ordered it done. That is the story of Peterloo. Not a footnote. Not a historical curiosity. Not an unfortunate excess in an otherwise orderly march toward progress. It is a story about what happens when the people who hold power decide that the demands of the powerless constitute a threat rather than an obligation. It is a story that has been told in different languages, in different countries, in different centuries, with different names attached to the dead and different uniforms on the cavalry. It is, in other words, not just a British story. It is a human one. And the reason it matters, the reason the industrial ledger is telling it now, 200 years after the horses rode in and the sabres came down, is not because the past is interesting. It is because the past is present. Because the arguments made in 1819 to justify sending cavalry into a crowd of unarmed civilians asking for political representation are structurally identical to the arguments made today when people with power respond to people without it who have the audacity to organize and demand to be heard. The language changes. The uniforms change. The weapons change. The logic does not. 18 people went to a field in Manchester on a summer morning to ask for the right to be counted. They never came home. Remember their names.